The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Whitmore mansion as Sarah Johnson quietly pushed her father's wheelchair through the servants' entrance. At 68, Marcus Johnson's once powerful frame had been reduced by years of diabetes and heart problems, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him the most trusted groundskeeper the Whitmore family had ever employed. Sarah adjusted her crisp white uniform and checked her watch. She had exactly 30 minutes before Mrs. Whitmore's breakfast needed to be served, but she couldn't bring herself to leave her father alone in their small quarters above the garage. The previous night had been difficult, with his blood pressure spiking and his breathing becoming labored. "You don't need to fuss over me, baby girl," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible in the grand hallway. "I've been taking care of myself longer than you've been alive." Sarah smiled despite her worry. Even now, confined to a wheelchair and dependent on medications, her father maintained the dignity that had earned him respect from 3 generations of Whitmores. She had grown up on this estate, watching him tend to every flower, every tree, every blade of grass, with the devotion of an artist perfecting his masterpiece. From his study window on the 2nd floor, Alexander Whitmore III watched the daily ritual unfold below. At 45, he had inherited not just the family fortune, but also the responsibility of maintaining their legacy. The tech empire his grandfather had built and his father had expanded now fell to him, along with the sprawling estate that housed their family for over a century. Alexander had noticed the changes in Marcus over the past few months. The man who had taught him to fish in the estate's pond, who had bandaged his scraped knees and listened to his teenage troubles, was slowly fading. But what struck Alexander most was Sarah's unwavering dedication to her father, even as she maintained her demanding responsibilities as head of household staff. Sarah had been working for the family since she graduated from college 15 years ago. What started as a temporary job to help pay off student loans had evolved into a career when she discovered her natural talent for managing the complex operations of a estate that regularly hosted political figures, business leaders, and celebrities. The irony wasn't lost on Alexander that while he struggled to maintain relationships with his own children, who lived with their mother across the country, Sarah had never wavered in her commitment to Marcus. Even when her father's medical bills began mounting and his condition required round-the-clock attention, she had refused Alexander's offers to hire additional help or move Marcus to a care facility. "Pride runs deep in the Johnson family," Alexander murmured to himself, remembering his father's words about Marcus. "Never known a man more devoted to his work or his principles." That pride was about to be tested in ways none of them could imagine. The trouble began with a phone call during lunch service. Sarah was coordinating with the kitchen staff when Mrs. Whitmore's personal assistant approached her with urgent news. The family's accountant had discovered significant financial discrepancies in the household budget over the past 6 months. Someone had been systematically skimming money from various accounts, and the investigation was pointing toward the staff. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the implications. The estate employed dozens of people, from groundskeepers to security personnel, many of whom had been with the family for decades. The thought that someone would betray that trust was devastating, but the possibility that suspicion might fall on her father was terrifying. Marcus had always handled petty cash for garden supplies and equipment maintenance. His meticulous record-keeping had been a source of pride throughout his career. But with his recent health problems and increasing confusion from medication, Sarah had been quietly helping him manage his responsibilities without telling anyone. Alexander called an emergency meeting with the security team and key staff members. The mansion's formal dining room, usually reserved for entertaining dignitaries, became an interrogation chamber as each employee was questioned about their access to financial accounts and their knowledge of the missing funds. When Marcus was wheeled into the room, Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. The medications had affected his memory, and she watched helplessly as he struggled to answer basic questions about his recent activities. The security chief's tone grew increasingly aggressive as Marcus fumbled with dates and couldn't recall specific transactions. Mr. Johnson, our records show significant cash withdrawals from the groundskeeping account that correspond with your requisitions, the security chief stated coldly. Can you account for these discrepancies? Marcus's hands trembled as he tried to sort through the papers in his lap. Sarah could see his confusion mounting as the numbers swam before his eyes. The medication made it difficult for him to concentrate, and the stress was causing his blood pressure to spike dangerously. I always kept receipts, Marcus stammered. Sarah, where are the receipts? I know I kept them all in the office. The security chief's expression hardened. Mr. Johnson, we need clear answers. The amounts involved are substantial and, frankly, your recent memory issues make your testimony unreliable. Sarah felt something snap inside her as she watched her father's dignity being stripped away. This man had given 43 years of his life to the Whitmore family, had worked through holidays and weekends, had taken pride in every aspect of his responsibilities. To see him reduced to a confused suspect was more than she could bear. That's enough, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. My father is not a thief. He's never taken so much as a pencil from this house without permission. The security chief turned his attention to Sarah, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Miss Johnson, you've had increasing access to your father's responsibilities. You've been signing for deliveries, handling his correspondence. Perhaps you'd like to explain your involvement in these transactions? Alexander watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. He had seen Sarah handle crisis after crisis with calm professionalism, but now he was witnessing something different. The protective fury in her eyes reminded him of a lioness defending her cub, and he began to question whether his security team was handling the investigation appropriately. I helped my father with paperwork when his arthritis made writing difficult, Sarah replied evenly. I never accessed any accounts or handled cash beyond what was necessary for daily operations. Every transaction was authorized and documented according to established procedures. But the evidence seemed damning. Computer records showed cash withdrawals that coincided with Marcus's work orders, and several receipts were missing from his files. The security chief pressed harder, suggesting that the Johnson family had been systematically stealing from the Whitmores for months. Sarah felt the walls closing in around them. She knew her father was innocent, but she also knew that his failing memory made it impossible for him to defend himself effectively. The medications, the stress, the confusion of being questioned like a criminal were taking a visible toll on his health. Mr. Johnson, I'm going to ask you directly, the security chief continued. Did you take money from the Whitmore accounts for personal use? Marcus looked up with tears in his eyes, his voice barely a whisper. I would never, 43 years, I would never betray this family. Alexander felt his chest tighten as he watched the interrogation. Marcus Johnson had been more than an employee. He had been a constant, stable presence throughout Alexander's childhood and adolescence. When Alexander's parents were traveling or busy with social obligations, Marcus had been the one who taught him about responsibility, hard work, and loyalty. The investigation was revealing more than financial discrepancies. It was exposing the complex relationships that existed within the mansion's walls, the delicate balance between employer and employee, between trust and suspicion. As the questioning continued, Alexander began to realize that the real theft might not be monetary, but something far more valuable: the destruction of relationships that had been built over decades. Sarah looked at her father's trembling hands and made a decision that would change everything. She could remain silent and hope the investigation would eventually clear them both, or she could take action to protect the man who had sacrificed everything to give her a better life. The choice was clearer than the consequences, and Sarah Johnson had never been one to back down from a difficult decision. As the security chief prepared to continue his questioning, Sarah stood up from her chair with quiet determination. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her, but her focus remained entirely on her father's tired, frightened face. What she was about to do would either save them both or destroy any chance they had of remaining at the estate that had been their home for so many years. But watching Marcus struggle to defend himself against accusations that were tearing apart his life's work, Sarah realized that some things were worth any risk. The afternoon sun was setting through the mansion's tall windows, casting the interrogation room in golden light that seemed to illuminate the crossroads where their lives now stood. In a few moments, everything would change, and there would be no going back to the careful balance they had maintained for so many years. Alexander sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere and found himself leaning forward, instinctively understanding that whatever happened next would reveal truths that went far beyond missing money or damaged trust. The real test was about to begin. Sarah's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Stop this right now." The security chief looked up in surprise, clearly not accustomed to being interrupted by household staff. "Miss Johnson, you're out of line. This is an official investigation and you're interrogating a sick man who's given his entire life to this family," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her chest. "My father has been taking medications that affect his memory. He's been struggling with diabetes and heart problems, but he still insisted on working because he believed in his duty to this house." Alexander watched as Sarah moved to stand behind her father's wheelchair, her hands resting protectively on his shoulders. There was something in her posture that reminded him of a guardian, unwilling to let anyone pass who might cause harm to the person under her protection. "The missing money," Sarah continued. "I know where it went." The room fell completely silent. Marcus looked up at his daughter with confusion and growing alarm. The security chief leaned forward, his pen poised over his notepad, while Alexander found himself holding his breath. "3 months ago, my father's medical bills started exceeding what our insurance would cover," Sarah explained. "His new medications cost $800 a month, and the specialists weren't covered under the employee health plan. He needed the money, but he was too proud to ask for an advance on his salary." Marcus tried to speak, but Sarah gently squeezed his shoulders. "Let me finish, Daddy." Alexander felt his heart sink as he began to understand what Sarah was about to confess. The Whitmore family had always prided itself on taking care of their employees, but clearly they had failed to recognize when someone was struggling. "I started taking small amounts from the petty cash," Sarah said, her voice never wavering. "I falsified some of the receipts and created fake invoices for garden supplies that we never ordered. I thought I could pay it back gradually from my own salary without anyone noticing." The security chief was writing furiously. "How much money are we talking about, Miss Johnson?" "Approximately $4,000 over the past 3 months, Sarah replied. "I have a detailed accounting of every transaction in my quarters. I was planning to tell Mr. Whitmore as soon as I figured out a way to repay the full amount." Marcus struggled to turn his wheelchair around to look at his daughter. "Sarah, no. Baby, what are you saying? You didn't take any money. I remember the receipts." But his voice trailed off as the medication and stress clouded his thoughts. Sarah knelt beside his wheelchair and took his trembling hands in hers. "Daddy, it's okay. I took care of everything. You don't have to worry anymore." Alexander stood up abruptly, causing everyone in the room to look at him. He had been silent throughout most of the interrogation, but now he could no longer remain passive. What he was witnessing wasn't just a confession. It was a daughter sacrificing herself to protect her father's dignity and reputation. "This investigation is over," Alexander announced. The security chief looked confused. "Sir, we have a confession. We need to document everything and decide on the appropriate course of action." "I said it's over," Alexander repeated, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Everyone except Miss Johnson and her father can leave now." As the room emptied, Alexander walked to the tall windows overlooking the gardens that Marcus had tended for over 4 decades. The roses were in perfect bloom, the hedges trimmed with mathematical precision, every pathway swept clean. It was the work of someone who took pride in perfection, who saw beauty in order and found meaning in service. "Miss Johnson," Alexander said without turning around, "how long have you been covering for your father's medical expenses?" Sarah remained kneeling beside Marcus's wheelchair. "Since the beginning of his health problems, sir. But I only started taking money from household accounts 3 months ago, when the costs became too high for my salary to cover." Alexander turned to face them both. Marcus looked smaller and more frail than ever, overwhelmed by the afternoon's events and confused by his daughter's confession. Sarah maintained her protective posture, prepared to accept whatever consequences her admission would bring. "Your father has been with this family since before I was born," Alexander said quietly. "He taught me how to drive a lawnmower when I was 12. He showed me how to plant bulbs so they would bloom in perfect rows each spring. When I was 16 and crashed my car after a party, he was the one who came to pick me up, and he never told my parents about the alcohol on my breath." Sarah looked up, uncertain where this conversation was leading. "Do you really think," Alexander continued, "that after everything your father has given to this family, I would allow him to suffer because of medical bills?" Marcus found his voice, weak but determined. "Mr. Alexander, I never asked for charity. I always earned my keep. I would never—" "You're right," Alexander interrupted gently. "You never asked for anything. That's the problem. We should have been taking better care of you, and we should have noticed when you were struggling." Sarah stood up slowly, her hand still resting on her father's shoulder. "Sir, I take full responsibility for the missing money. My father had nothing to do with my decisions. I'm prepared to accept the consequences and arrange for repayment." Alexander studied her face. Seeing the same determination that had made her an exceptional employee and the same loyalty that had driven her to risk everything for her father. "Tell me something, Miss Johnson. Do you really believe you took that money?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "Yes, sir. I just confessed to taking it." "I've watched you work for 15 years, Alexander said, walking closer to them. "I've seen you handle million-dollar events without losing a single receipt. I've watched you coordinate with vendors, manage staff schedules, and track expenses down to the penny. You're possibly the most honest person I've ever known." Sarah felt a flutter of uncertainty. "Sir, I don't understand." Alexander picked up the security chief's abandoned notepad and flipped through the pages of evidence. "The missing money corresponds exactly with your father's medical needs. The timing aligns with his worsening health. The amounts are precise enough to cover his prescriptions and treatments. It's almost as if someone calculated exactly how much was needed and took only that amount." Marcus looked confused, his medication-clouded mind struggling to follow the conversation. Sarah felt her carefully constructed confession beginning to crumble under Alexander's scrutiny. "But here's what doesn't make sense," Alexander continued. "The computer records show that the withdrawals were made using your father's access codes, not yours. The receipts that are missing were ones he was responsible for, not you. And most importantly, you've been covering his medical expenses with your own salary for months before any money went missing." Sarah's heart began racing as she realized that Alexander was systematically dismantling her confession. She had been so focused on protecting her father that she hadn't considered how her lies might unravel under careful examination. "Mr. Alexander," she said carefully, "I understand you might find it hard to believe, but—" "What I find hard to believe," Alexander interrupted, "is that you would lie to protect someone else's reputation, even if it meant destroying your own." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus looked from his daughter to Alexander, slowly beginning to understand what was happening. Despite his confusion and failing memory, he recognized the look on Sarah's face, the same expression she had worn as a child when she tried to take blame for broken dishes or trampled flowers. "Sarah," Marcus whispered, his voice growing stronger with realization. "What did you do?" Sarah felt tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I protected you, Daddy, just like you protected me my whole life." Alexander watched the exchange between father and daughter and felt something shift in his understanding of loyalty and sacrifice. Throughout his privileged life, he had been surrounded by people who wanted something from his family: money, connections, opportunities. But here was someone willing to sacrifice her career and reputation for no gain except protecting someone she loved. "The truth is," Alexander said softly, "your father did take the money. His medical bills were overwhelming him, and in moments of confusion caused by his medications, he made decisions he wouldn't normally make. But he was too proud to admit it, and too confused to remember exactly what happened." Sarah's protective instincts flared again. "Sir, with respect, my father is not a thief. Whatever happened—" "You're right," Alexander agreed. "He's not a thief. He's a man who served this family faithfully for over 40 years and found himself in an impossible situation. The fault isn't his for taking money he desperately needed. The fault is ours for not ensuring he had adequate health care coverage." Marcus began to speak, but his voice was lost in a fit of coughing that left him gasping for breath. Sarah immediately knelt beside him again, checking his pulse and watching his breathing with the practiced eye of someone who had been monitoring medical crises for months. "We need to get him to his medication," Sarah said urgently. "I'll call Dr. Harrison to come immediately," Alexander replied, reaching for his phone. As Sarah wheeled Marcus toward the door, Alexander called out to stop her. "Miss Johnson, this conversation isn't over, but right now, taking care of your father is the only priority." Later that evening, after Dr. Harrison had stabilized Marcus and adjusted his medications, Alexander found Sarah sitting alone in the mansion's library. She was still wearing her uniform, but her usually perfect appearance was disheveled from the day's stress. "How is he?" Alexander asked, settling into the leather chair across from her. "Stable for now," Sarah replied. "Dr. Harrison says the stress made everything worse, but the new medication should help with the confusion." Alexander nodded, then leaned forward in his chair. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. Not the truth you think will protect your father, but the actual truth." Sarah met his gaze directly. "I've told you the truth, sir." "No," Alexander said gently. "You've told me the story you think will save your father's reputation. There's a difference." The weight of the day's events finally caught up with Sarah, and she felt her careful composure beginning to crack. She had spent months watching her father struggle with illness, confusion, and pride. She had covered for his mistakes, managed his responsibilities, and tried to preserve his dignity while he slowly faded from the strong man he had once been. "He forgot," she whispered finally. "Daddy started forgetting things. Little things at first. Where he put tools, whether he had ordered supplies. The medication made it worse. And when the medical bills started coming, when the insurance wouldn't cover everything, he panicked." Alexander waited patiently as Sarah found the courage to continue. "He started taking small amounts from petty cash, thinking he could replace it before anyone noticed. But then he would forget that he had taken it, or forget to get receipts, or get confused about what the money was for. I tried to cover for him, to fix the paperwork, to make everything balance." Sarah looked up at Alexander with tears finally spilling over. "I couldn't let anyone know that Daddy was losing his memory. He was so proud of his work, so proud of his reputation with your family. Watching him struggle to remember things was breaking my heart, but watching other people see his confusion would have killed him. Alexander felt a profound sadness settling over him as he finally understood the full scope of what the Johnson family had been enduring. "Sarah, why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you ask for help?" "Because," Sarah said simply, "asking for help would have meant admitting that Daddy couldn't do his job anymore. And losing his job would have meant losing his identity, his purpose, everything that made him feel valuable." The library fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Alexander looked at this woman who had managed his household with such skill and dedication, who had protected her father's dignity at the cost of her own peace of mind, and realized he was seeing real courage for perhaps the first time in his life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions. But tonight, in the quiet of his family's library, Alexander Whitmore began to understand that some things were far more valuable than money, and some loyalty couldn't be bought at any price. Alexander spent most of the night walking through the mansion's corridors, thinking about everything Sarah had revealed. By dawn, he had made several decisions that would change not only the Johnson family's future, but also his own understanding of what it meant to be responsible for the people who worked for him. The first call he made was to his personal attorney, followed by conversations with his financial advisor and the family's insurance company. By the time Sarah arrived for work that morning, Alexander had already been in his study for 3 hours, making arrangements that would have seemed impossible the day before. Sarah knocked softly on the study door, expecting to receive her termination and possibly discuss legal consequences for the missing money. Instead, she found Alexander surrounded by paperwork, medical insurance forms, and what appeared to be legal documents. "Please, sit down," Alexander said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "How is your father this morning?" "Better, thank you," Sarah replied cautiously. "The new medication seems to be helping with the confusion. Dr. Harrison wants to adjust his treatment plan based on what happened yesterday." Alexander nodded, then leaned back in his chair. "Sarah, I've spent the night thinking about what you told me, and I realize I owe you and your father an apology." Sarah looked surprised. "Sir? I don't understand. We're the ones who—" "No," Alexander interrupted firmly. "You're the ones who have been struggling alone with problems that this family should have been helping you solve months ago. Your father has given 43 years of his life to maintaining this estate, and when he needed medical care, our insurance coverage failed him. When he needed support, we failed to notice. When he made mistakes because of his illness, we treated him like a criminal, instead of recognizing that he needed help." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the unexpected direction of the conversation. She had prepared herself for anger, disappointment, and consequences, but not for understanding and acceptance. "I've made several changes that will go into effect immediately," Alexander continued. "First, I'm upgrading the healthcare coverage for all long-term employees and their families. Your father's medical expenses will be covered completely, including the bills he's been struggling to pay." Sarah's eyes widened. "Mr. Alexander, that's incredibly generous, but we can't accept—" "You can, and you will," Alexander said with a slight smile. "It's not generosity, it's what should have been in place all along. But there's more." Alexander picked up a folder from his desk and handed it to Sarah. "I'm creating a new position, estate care coordinator. The job involves overseeing the welfare of all staff and their families, ensuring that everyone has access to appropriate health care, managing crisis situations, and serving as a liaison between employees and management." Sarah opened the folder and found a detailed job description along with a salary figure that made her gasp. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "The position comes with a private apartment in the main house, so you can be close to your father," Alexander continued. "And it includes a comprehensive benefit package that will cover any future medical needs for both of you." Tears began flowing down Sarah's cheeks as she realized what Alexander was offering. Not only was he solving their financial crisis, but he was recognizing the value of what she had been doing informally, protecting and caring for the people around her. "As for your father," Alexander said gently, "I'm not asking him to retire. I'm creating a new role for him as well. Garden Heritage Advisor. He'll work with the current groundskeeping staff to share his knowledge and expertise without the physical demands of daily maintenance. His salary will remain the same, but his responsibilities will focus on what he knows best, the history and care of these gardens." Sarah was openly crying now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Alexander's response to their crisis. "Why?" she managed to ask. "After everything that's happened, why are you doing this?" Alexander stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the gardens Marcus had tended for so many years. "Yesterday, when I watched you protect your father, I realized something about loyalty that I had never understood before. In my world, loyalty is usually bought. People are nice to me because of what I can do for them. But what you did for your father, what he did for this family over all these years, that's real loyalty. That's the kind of devotion that can't be purchased." He turned back to face Sarah. "My children live across the country with their mother. I see them a few times a year, and our relationship is complicated by divorce settlements and custody agreements. But your father raised you to be the kind of person who would sacrifice everything to protect someone she loves. Yesterday, I envied that relationship more than I've ever envied anyone's wealth or success." Sarah wiped her tears and tried to compose herself. "Mr. Alexander, I appreciate this more than you can imagine. But I need you to understand something. My father didn't steal that money out of greed or dishonesty. The medication, the confusion, the pride, it all combined into a perfect storm that made him make choices he never would have made when he was healthy." "I know," Alexander replied softly. "And that's exactly why these changes need to happen. Not just for your family, but for everyone who works here. We need systems in place so that no one feels they have to choose between their health and their dignity." There was a gentle knock on the study door, and Marcus appeared in his wheelchair, looking more alert than he had in weeks. The new medication was clearly helping, and the stress of the previous day's interrogation had been replaced by confusion about why Sarah had been summoned to see Alexander so early. "Daddy, come in," Sarah said, standing to help him navigate his wheelchair into the room. "Mr. Alexander has something to tell you." Marcus looked wary, clearly expecting the worst. "Mr. Alexander, I want to apologize for whatever confusion I caused with the accounts. Sarah shouldn't have to pay for my mistakes." Alexander knelt down beside Marcus's wheelchair, putting himself at eye level with the older man. "Marcus, you've been part of this family since before I was born. You taught me about responsibility, hard work, and taking care of things that matter. The only mistake here was mine, for not ensuring you had everything you needed when your health started failing." Marcus looked confused but hopeful. "I don't understand, sir. I'm saying that your job is safe, your medical bills will be covered, and you'll never have to worry about money for health care again," Alexander explained patiently. "What's more, I'm asking you to take on a new role teaching the younger staff about the gardens you've spent 40 years perfecting." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. Then, slowly, tears began forming in his eyes. "You mean I can stay? I can keep working?" "As long as you want to," Alexander assured him. "These gardens are your legacy, Marcus. No one else knows their secrets the way you do." Sarah watched her father's face transform as pride and relief washed over him. For months, she had seen him struggle with the fear that his illness would cost him everything that gave his life meaning. Now, instead of punishment for his confusion and mistakes, he was being offered respect and security. "There's one more thing," Alexander said, standing up and returning to his desk. "The money that was taken from the household accounts. We're calling it an advance against future medical expenses. There's no debt to repay, no punishment, no black mark against anyone's record." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For months, she had been terrified that her father's condition would be discovered and that he would lose not just his job, but his sense of worth. Instead, his illness was being acknowledged and accommodated with dignity. "Mr. Alexander," Sarah said, "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Alexander replied. "You've already done more for this family than we ever did for you. What you did yesterday, taking responsibility to protect your father, that showed me something about character that I won't forget." Marcus reached out and took Sarah's hand in his trembling fingers. "Baby girl, you didn't have to protect me like that." "Yes, Daddy, I did," Sarah said firmly. "Just like you protected me my whole life. That's what family does." Alexander watched the exchange and felt something shift in his understanding of what really mattered in life. His own children barely knew him, despite having every material advantage money could provide, but here was a relationship built on sacrifice, loyalty, and unconditional love, the kind of bond he had spent his entire adult life trying to recreate with his own family. Over the following weeks, the changes Alexander had implemented began transforming the entire atmosphere of the estate. The new healthcare coverage gave every employee peace of mind about their family's well-being. Sarah's new role allowed her to identify and address problems before they became crises. Marcus found renewed purpose in teaching younger staff about the intricate systems he had developed for maintaining the gardens. But perhaps the most significant change was in Alexander himself. He began spending more time talking with his employees, learning about their lives beyond their work responsibilities. He discovered that the chef's daughter was struggling in school and arranged for tutoring. He learned that one of the security guards was taking night classes and adjusted his schedule to accommodate his studies. The mansion that had once felt like a sterile showcase began to feel like a community where people cared about each other's welfare. 3 months later, Alexander received a call from his ex-wife asking if their children could spend the summer at the estate. For the first time in years, he felt confident about what he could offer them. Not just material comfort, but examples of loyalty, dedication, and genuine care for other people. As he walked through the gardens with Marcus one evening, listening to stories about each plant and tree, Alexander realized that the theft investigation had revealed something far more valuable than missing money. It had shown him what real wealth looked like: relationships built on trust, loyalty earned through decades of consistency, and the willingness to sacrifice for people you love. "Mr. Marcus," Alexander said as they paused beside a rose bush that had been blooming for 30 years, "I want to ask you something. What made you decide to stay with this family for so long?" Marcus smiled, his confusion from the medication finally under control with proper dosing. "It wasn't just a job, Mr. Alexander. Your grandfather hired me when nobody else would give a young black man a chance to prove himself. Your father treated me with respect when others wouldn't. And you grew up to be the kind of man who sees past mistakes to the heart of a person." Alexander felt humbled by the assessment. "I almost made a terrible mistake with that investigation." "But you didn't," Marcus replied. "When it mattered most, you chose to protect your people instead of just your money. That's what real leadership looks like." As the sun set over the perfectly maintained gardens, Alexander understood that the real shock to the mansion hadn't been the missing money or the investigation. It had been the revelation that the most valuable things in his life couldn't be measured in dollars. They were measured in the loyalty of people like Marcus and Sarah, who chose to stay not because of what they could gain, but because of what they could give. Sarah found them there an hour later, Father and Billionaire sitting in comfortable silence among the roses that represented decades of faithful service. She smiled as she watched them, understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquering others, but from learning to value what you already have. The mansion was no longer just a house where wealthy people lived. It had become a home where people took care of each other, where loyalty was rewarded with loyalty, and where the true meaning of family extended far beyond blood relationships. The black maid who had shielded her frail father had indeed shocked the mansion, but not with scandal or shame. She had shocked it awake to the possibility that power used wisely could create something beautiful, a community where everyone's dignity was protected, everyone's contribution was valued, and everyone's welfare mattered. And the billionaire who had watched it all unfold had learned the most valuable lesson of his privileged life, that real wealth isn't about what you can afford to lose, but about what you choose to protect.